welcome back to WH2. I hope you're doing well today. Last time we finished up our look of the Vietnam War, and today we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to be talking about the Middle East, and we'll be focusing on the Middle East from the 1960s up until the first Gulf War. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
On the Middle East, it's kind of difficult to compress all that has taken place in the Middle East in the past 40 years. I have put the dates at their top, 1960 to 2003. The course actually just goes to 2001 with 9/11, but 2003 was with the invasion of Iraq by the coalition forces to take out Saddam Hussein. But that's not part of this course, so it's not on the exam or anything. It's not even in this PowerPoint. It's just that I put the dates up there just to let you know that the tensions in the Middle East are definitely continuing, and it does not seem like there's any kind of drawdown of any kind of forces in the Middle East or tensions in the Middle East. I've tried to pull out the major events that have taken place in the Middle East. It's a very broad overview, not getting into any kind of real great detail of these events, but just to let you know that a lot has happened, especially after World War II, with the creation of new countries or the independence of different countries. But many states were created after World War II or they became independent. Lebanon 1943, Syria 1944, so those were obviously during World War II. Jordan 1946, Iraq 1947, Egypt 1947, Israel 1948. A lot of these countries had either French control or British control, and they got their independence. 1947, there were serious tensions between Jews and Palestinians, and that would continue on all the way till today. There's highs and lows. There's war and ceasefires and armistices and just different ways of controlling the fighting, but it has been raging ever since their creation, basically. Most of these countries have Islamic states with various forms of government, except obviously Israel is not Islamic and is definitely a target of the Islamic nations in the Middle East. And that's evident from everything from the different problems with the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip incidents to the Gulf War, which is called Desert Storm, where Iraq was shooting Scud missiles into Israel. So there's serious tensions going on. Okay, so we'll talk about the Israeli wars. Israel was involved in many wars since its creation in 1948. Now, there's a general kind of term called the Arab-Israeli War, and that's from 1948 till the present. It's just an overall term for the ongoing tensions and military actions between Israel and Arab countries. And there's been the specific wars that we'll just briefly go through, where Israel invades or the Arabs invade or whatever the back and forth is. But the Arab-Israeli War is just a general kind of term for what's going on over there in the Middle East. And I'll bring a map up of the Middle East here just in a little bit. 1956 is the Suez War. Israel and then later the British and the French invaded Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal, because the Suez Canal is kind of like a lifeline there to enter into the Mediterranean Sea. And when Egypt attempted to take control of the Suez Canal, Israel and then British and the French came in and had to get it back. 1967, the Six-Day War, because it lasted 6 days. Egypt massed military units to remove the United Nations. So Israel ended up invading the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had a victory, and they occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. So here's a map of the Six-Day War. Here's Israel before the Six-Day War, and it's very small. Israel is not large at all, very small. And when we say Gaza Strip, West Bank, and the Golan Heights, this here, let me get my cursor, this here is Gaza, or along the Mediterranean Sea. That's called the Gaza Strip. The West Bank is this area right here, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River. Okay, so when you hear the word West Bank, maybe you hear it in the news or something like that, it means it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. And then the Golan Heights is up here. Okay, now what happened is this land has gone back and forth between the Palestinians who claim it to be theirs and the Israelis who claim it to be theirs. And so after the 6-day war, you can see that Gaza Strip was occupied, the West Bank was occupied, and the Golan Heights was occupied. And of course, during the 6-day war, Israel invaded Sinai. And here's the Suez Canal right through here. So Israel invaded Sinai. So this is what they occupied during the 6-day war. And of course, after negotiations and all of that, you see here on the map, it says they withdrew from Sinai in 1982, and they removed from Gaza in 2005. So they occupied for quite a long time, and there will be more war going on during that time up until they withdrew. Here's some movements, just a quick map of the 6-day war. Israel, here's their border, and they invaded Sinai all the way to the Suez Canal. If you didn't know what the Suez Canal is, you have the Red Sea coming up through here, and you have this branch of the Red Sea, which is called the Gulf of Suez, and then there was a canal created through this land area here. Here's more of a closer look over here on the right. And so Egypt tried to control that. Israeli wars continued in 1970. There was a war of attrition, that's what it was called, which was basically artillery duels along the Suez Canal with commando raids. 1973 was a more well-known war because of when it took place, the Yom Kippur War. That was a surprise attack by Arab countries, a coalition of Arab countries on Jewish Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement and Repentance for the Jews. And that fighting was focused on the Golan Heights, which again is up here. 1982 was the Lebanon War, Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon after the PLO, which is called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, repeatedly attacked Israel. So again, that's up here. There's continuous conflict with the Palestinians even till today. The next major event that we'll talk about is the 1972 Olympic Massacre. It was an attack at the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany. 8 Black September, that's a Palestinian terrorist group called Black September. 8 Black September members kidnapped 11 Israelis from the Israeli Olympic team. They held them as hostages and demanded 243 Palestinians to be freed from prison. So there was a commando raid that tried to free the hostages, but it failed, and 11 of the Israelis were killed. 5 Black September members were killed, and the others were captured. So the hostage situation ended. But in the process of ending it, the 11 Israelis were killed. Here's some pictures. These are actual photographs. On the left are 2 Israeli Olympic coaches talking to the German negotiators. And then on the right is a Black September member. There's a snapshot of one on a balcony. When this situation ended, all of these that are pictured were killed. The next major event is the Iranian Revolution in Iran, January of 78 to February of 79. Basically, it was an overthrow of the Shah, which is the king, and the establishment of the Ayatollah, which is the office of the new leader. It literally means source to follow, the Ayatollah. It was popular with students. It was popular with the left wing of the government and left-wing leaning people. There was much civil unrest. There was street fighting. And the revolution basically changed the type of government, and then that type of government would morph over time to basically being a military dictatorship led by the Ayatollah. It resulted in a couple of things. The first is the oil crisis of 1979, followed by the Iran hostage crisis, and then the Iran-Iraq war. So we'll go through these. The Iranian hostage crisis occurred November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981. And there was a rescue attempt which failed because of mechanical problems of the helicopter that was bringing the commandos in, the special forces in to attempt the rescue. Well, the helicopter had a problem. And what happened was President Jimmy Carter addressed the nation and accepted responsibility of this failed attempt. Well, when he got on the TV and said this and took responsibility for it, it really damaged his image. And he was coming up for re-election against Ronald Reagan. And this Iranian hostage crisis really damaged him, and Ronald Reagan was elected as president. So January 21st, 1981, which is my birthday, January 21st, 1981, all of the American hostages in Iran were released through negotiations. And that was the day that President Reagan was giving his inaugural speech. And there's different conspiracies about that, like were there secret deals that went on with the Reagan administration and all of that. But the tensions were really out ahead. Here's some pictures. Iranian students invading the U.S. Embassy on the left. And then you see two American hostages there. The one on the right, they both might be Marines, but the one on the right is in a Marine uniform. Okay, so Iran-Iraq War, 1980, 1988. Iraq invaded Iran to become a dominant power in the Middle East. This whole situation is also troublesome, especially in the United States, because of the oil situation in the Middle East, and it caused an oil crisis during Jimmy Carter's presidency, where there was basically gas rationing in the United States. Gas stations had run out of gas, and there were long lines, and you could only get a certain amount of gas. It was just all big tumultuous event in the Middle East that kind of fell down onto the United States also. We were very involved in it. The Iran-Iraq War was a war when Iraq invaded Iran to become a dominant power in the Middle East. Iraq had feared that the Iranian Revolution would influence the Iraqi Shiite majority to rebel against Saddam Hussein's Iraqi Ba'ath government. So the Shiites had a majority, but the government controlled by Saddam Hussein, the Ba'ath Party, controlled the government. They were afraid that the Shiites would try to overthrow the Ba'aths like the Iranian Revolution. Well, the United States backed Iraq because of the U.S. poor relations with Iran. And so you think about that, the United States was backing Saddam Hussein, but in 1990, 1991, we are going to go to war against Saddam Hussein. But anyway, back to the story. The United States was backing Iraq, and the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner, killing 290 passengers. And when this situation occurred, it really had a big international uproar over this because of what took place with it being an airliner. The U.S. basically was trying to get the airliner to identify itself, and they refused or did not respond, and they continuously did not respond after many attempts to have them identify themselves. And so now you have this aircraft in the sky not answering the calls and not identifying itself, and so it was deemed a threat, and it was shot down. After the investigation and all of that, the United States regretted the action that it did, but it was just poor relations with Iran. The Iran-Iraq War ended with a UN ceasefire. Okay, so now we need to talk about the Persian Gulf War. It's also called Desert Storm. August 2nd, 1990 to February 28th, 1991, 35 nations went to war against Iraq to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. What happened was on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait over oil production disputes. And whenever you have a problem with oil in the Middle East or some kind of dispute over it, it's going to affect countries around the world, especially large consuming countries such as the United States, such as Great Britain, and others. But there was a strong U.S. reaction, and then the UN Security Council brought sanctions against Iraq. So Saddam Hussein and his forces, they refused to leave Kuwait after the UN Security Council said they had to leave Kuwait. So a coalition built up their military called Operation Desert Shield. Now this buildup was mainly staged in Saudi Arabia, there was some in Turkey, and there was definitely ships offshore, off of the shore of Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein was basically getting surrounded by the coalition forces. And of course, by this time, our technology, we had long-range bombers and stealth fighters. So Saddam Hussein was just not in a good position. Most of his military was old. His equipment was old. A lot of it was left over from the Iran-Iraq War, which was basically Russian. Most of his military was of Russian origin, but his military was not anywhere near the coalition forces in number or in technology. Negotiations failed, and Operation Desert Storm began on January 16th, 1991, with an air war, and this was a very interesting war because you had pinpoint guided bombs with video feed from the bombs themselves or from the airplanes that were dropping the bombs. And so you had, you watch on TV a military briefing where there's video shown of bombs being dropped on bridges and on buildings, and it was very precise and very impressive to see that. Unfortunately, the Iraqis set fire to 700 oil wells, which caused obviously lack of production of oil, but also a great environmental crisis with all of the toxic fumes spewing into the air from the oil wells. Here's a map of how Iraq invaded Kuwait. So you see Kuwait has a large shoreline for the Persian Gulf. Iraq also has a small shoreline here, but there's a lot of oil in Kuwait, and so they came in and basically took over Kuwait. Here's a picture from the Gulf War of fighter jets in formation. You can see that the oil wellheads have been set on fire, and it took a while for teams to be able to come in and put those fires out. The military would not put those fires out. You would have to have oil crews that knew how to deal with that kind of emergency to come in and cap the oil wells. All right, continuing the Persian Gulf, on February 24th to 28th, 1991, the ground war began. So there was massive bombings by air, and then the ground war began. And the ground war was known for massive U.S. tank movements because there was a lot of armor used. So this would be like the Abrams tank. A lot of armor was used, and they used armored bulldozers to blast through and plow through these large berms of sand that the Iraqis had built for obstacles. And the tanks would move in, and there was a lot of accuracy with the way our tanks fire, and also the type of ammunition we use with depleted uranium rounds can pierce through the tanks that the Iraqis had. February 27th, there was an incident called Highway of Death, which 1,400 Iraqi military vehicles attempted to escape into Iraq from Kuwait. So the Iraqis knew that they were being beaten. This is the day before the ground war ended, so it was it was their time. They were basically retreating. They were wanting to get out of Kuwait, get back home to Iraq, and there was a highway that took them back to Iraq. Well, as they're all trying to flee, U.S. intelligence found them out, and they sent in A-10. They're called A-10 bombers or airplanes. They they have the nickname called the Warthog. So it's called an A-10 Warthog, and it just decimated this column. The ground campaign was so overwhelming that the war ended 100 hours after it started. So the ground war did not last long at all. I mean, 100 hours, that was the ground war. The aftermath, March 10th, 1991, 540,000 U.S. soldiers began coming home. So you can see it was a large number of U.S. soldiers, about the same number at the height of the Vietnam War. U.S. dead was 146, compared to Iraqi dead of estimated around 35,000. So very little loss of life. Of that 146, I believe it was 35 of them were killed by accident instead of direct combat. The result, Kuwait was free and the U.S. maintained a presence there in the Middle East. But the last bullet point there on the slide, Saddam Hussein remained president of Iraq. And obviously that would come back to haunt the United States in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, and where we would topple Saddam Hussein, and he would then be tried and executed for crimes against his own people. Here's a map with the military units that fought in the Persian Gulf. But you see over here we have a lot of staged units along this border. This is Saudi Arabia, this is Iraq, and this is Kuwait. And you had these massive hooks coming in with airborne drops, the 82nd, the 101st. Coming in here, you have the armor movements. So here's your armor divisions down here. They came in with these massive hooks into Iraq. Here's another armor. Here's the Marines, the 1st Marine Division. And you had other coalition forces. You had basically all lined up here. A massive military force. You have the British here. You have the French here. And they just swung in and basically cut off. These are the Iraqi forces. They basically swung in and they cut them off from their escape. General Schwarzkopf made a famous statement that General Schwarzkopf was in charge of this whole campaign. He said his campaign strategy was to cut them off and kill them. That was his strategy. Here's some pictures. Ground war. There's a tank firing. There's some infantry crossing some barbed wire. Here's an A-10 Warthog. This is basically the plane that was used during the Highway of Death. And the interesting thing about this plane is basically this cannon. It has bombs and missiles and all of that, but this cannon underneath shoots a very large bullet, large round. And this cannon is really long within the plane itself. And so basically what they did was they built the plane around the cannon. And it's a rotary type gun, kind of like a Gatling gun, rotary type, a lot of barrels in this cannon. There's a picture of the Highway of Death. They were just sitting ducks, basically. And the U.S. victory parade. So unlike Vietnam, when the soldiers came back, not welcomed back. There was no fanfare. There was just, it was just basically soldiers coming back from their rotations in Vietnam, and were not looked at as heroes, or were not looked at as going over and defeating the enemy. The Gulf War, basically the people came home as heroes. There was campaigns. You can see it here on the poles. There are yellow ribbons. And all across the United States, people would tie yellow ribbons around trees and lamp posts and other poles. in support of the war and in support of the soldiers that went and fought. Okay, so that's it for the PowerPoint for the Middle East. I'll see you in a second.
All right, class, that's it for today. Next time, we're looking at the terrorist attacks that took place on September 11th of 2001. I'll see you then.